You know, sometimes you think you've seen it all, until a moment comes along that just knocks the wind out of the room. It was day 17 of the trial. The courtroom had settled into a familiar rhythm by then. Lawyers scribbling notes, reporters whispering to each other, and the judge stone-faced as ever. Diddy sat there, arms crossed, that same tight expression he'd worn since day one. The air felt heavy, like everyone was bracing for something, but no one knew what. Then it happened. The doors at the back opened, and in walked George Clooney. Yeah, that George Clooney. Hollywood royalty, smooth as silk, usually seen in tuxedos and glossy movie trailers, not testifying in federal court. For a second you could hear a pin drop. Even the clicking of laptop keys stopped. The silence wasn't just surprise. It was confusion. Murmurs started almost immediately. People leaned over, whispering, "Is that actually him?" As if their eyes were lying. He didn't play it up. He didn't flash a smile or nod to the crowd. He just walked straight to the stand, calm and quiet, like a man with a job to do. His suit was simple, gray, nothing flashy, and his face carried a kind of seriousness that made you sit up a little straighter in your seat. Now, this wasn't some stunt. This wasn't for cameras or headlines. You could tell from the way he looked around that room. There was a weight to it, like he'd been turning this over in his mind for a long time. And today, he'd decided it was time to speak. The judge asked him to state his name for the record. He did, in that steady, unmistakable voice of his. And just like that, George Clooney was under oath. No one expected it. Not the press. Not the defense. Maybe not even Diddy himself. You could see a flicker of surprise cross his face. Just for a second, like he wasn't sure whether to be amused or worried. But Clooney wasn't there to play games. His eyes didn't wander. He didn't fidget. He looked straight ahead, calm but focused, like he'd been carrying a truth on his shoulders for years, and he'd finally found the right place to set it down. And that's when things started to shift. The whole tone of the courtroom changed. You could feel it. This wasn't just another celebrity cameo. This was about something real. So once George Clooney was settled in the witness chair, the prosecutor stood up, adjusted his glasses, and got straight to the point. "Mr. Clooney," he asked, "can you tell the court why you're here today?" And George leaned in just a little, laced his fingers together, and said something that turned a few heads. "I knew Cassie," he said plainly. Not well, but well enough to notice something was wrong. Now that name, Cassie, had already been at the center of this trial. Testimonies? Documents? Videos? But hearing George Clooney say her name? That added a weight. It made people sit forward in their seats. He explained how they'd met a few years back at one of those music industry events. Not the red carpet kind, but the more private ones. The ones where people mingle behind closed doors. He said Cassie stood out. Not because she was loud or flashy, actually the opposite. She was polite, soft-spoken. You could tell she was the kind of person who paid attention to everyone in the room. And yet, George said, there was something behind her eyes, something a little guarded. He started going into details about the parties. Not just regular parties, but the exclusive, high-security, invite-only type. The kind where cameras weren't allowed and everybody's got their guard up, but not for the usual reasons. These were the kind of places where powerful people let their masks slip just a little, and that's where George first noticed how Diddy treated her. He said it wasn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it was in the way he dismissed her mid-sentence, or how he'd call her over, only to ignore her once she got there. But there were moments, ugly moments, where it went further. George shared one night in particular. It was a gathering at a private house in the hills. Lavish, over the top. Music was playing, drinks were flowing, and Diddy was holding court like always. But in the middle of it all, Clooney saw something that stuck with him. Cassie had said something. He didn't remember what exactly, but it set Diddy off. Right there in front of a few people, Diddy snapped at her. Not loud enough to cause a scene, but sharp. Mean. The kind of tone that makes the room go still for a second. He told her to shut up and said she was lucky to even be standing. Here. Then he turned back to his drink like nothing happened. George paused there, sitting on the stand. You could tell he was replaying that moment in his head. He said, It wasn't just the words, it was the way she flinched. Like it wasn't the first time. He looked down for a second, then added, "I've been around long enough to know when someone's walking on eggshells." And Cassie, she was always careful, always watching him, like she never knew which version of him she was going to get. The prosecutor let that sink in before asking, "And you chose to come forward now. Why?" George nodded slowly. "Because I should have done it then. But I didn't. I thought maybe it wasn't my place. Maybe I just imagined it. But I didn't. And now that Cassie's spoken up, I owe it to her. To tell the truth I saw, even if it's just a piece of it." There it was. The reason he was called. Not for headlines, not for show, but because he'd witnessed something years ago that he could no longer keep to himself. After sharing what he'd seen at those parties, George grew quieter. He shifted a little in the witness chair, not uncomfortably, but like he was digging into a memory that had been buried for a while. "There was one time," he began, "I pulled Cassie aside." He said it wasn't planned. It was one of those late nights, after another one of Diddy's high-end gatherings. Most of the crowd had thinned out, and the music had dulled to a background hum. George noticed Cassie standing, alone near the patio, arms crossed, kind of hugging herself. She wasn't talking to anyone, just staring out at the hills like her mind was somewhere far off. So he walked over. He said, "Hey, everything all right?" Cassie turned and gave him this small, tired smile. The kind of smile you give someone when you want to be polite but you're too exhausted to pretend. "I'm fine," she said. But George said her eyes told a different story. He remembered how she avoided eye contact, how she kept touching her wrist absent-mindedly, like she was trying to comfort herself. He asked again, gently this time, "Are you sure?" And she nodded, too quickly. Now George has been in Hollywood long enough to recognize performance. And what he saw that night wasn't a person being fine. It was a person surviving. He didn't press her. Maybe part of him didn't want to cross a line. Or maybe he thought she needed space. But he remembered feeling this deep unease in his chest, like he was watching someone drowning in plain sight, and he wasn't sure how to throw a rope without making it worse. He paused in court when he told this part, looked down at his hands for a moment. "I should have said more," he admitted. "But she just seemed so afraid of saying the wrong thing. Like even that conversation, even standing there talking to me, might come back to haunt her later." He took a breath and went on to describe what Cassie was like in those days. She was kind, always said thank you, always remembered people's names. Just one of those people who made you feel seen, even if she barely knew you. But she also had this stillness about her. Not calm, more like quiet tension, like someone who's learned how to be invisible when they need to be. Those words hung in the courtroom like smoke, because once he said them, people started to picture her. Not as the woman in the tabloids or the music videos, but as a young woman navigating a world full of powerful men, trying not to make waves, trying to survive with as little damage as possible. And for George, that conversation, that moment on the patio, never left him. It lingered, tucked away in the back of his mind for years, coming back to him every time he saw her name in the news, every time another quiet story came to light. "I didn't know how deep it went," he said softly, "but I knew something wasn't right." And I never forgot the way she said, "I'm fine." Not once. George took a breath before he spoke again. This time his voice had a different weight to it, like he was bracing himself for what came next. "There was one night I'll never forget," he said. "It wasn't just another celebrity party. This one felt darker from the start. It was at a mansion in the Hollywood Hills, one of those places so big it didn't feel real. You walk in and everything's too shiny, too perfect, but the people feel off." Clooney said he almost didn't go. He was tired, coming off a film shoot, but a friend had invited him, and he figured he'd stop by for a drink and leave early. He didn't expect what he walked into. He described the mood of the party as strange. Loud music. Too many people trying too hard to look relaxed. That kind of energy where everyone's smiling, but no one's actually having a good time. There was a lot of drinking, and something about the way people acted made him uneasy, like they were performing for each other, not just partying. Then he saw Cassie. She walked in with Diddy, a step or two behind him. George noticed right away how she moved, slowly, carefully, like her body was sore. She had on long sleeves, even though it was warm inside, and kept brushing her hair over one side of her face. At first, George didn't think much of it, but later that evening, as the crowd thinned and people started lounging around the pool or wandering into private rooms, he found himself on the balcony, alone. That's when Cassie stepped out for air. She didn't see him at first. She leaned on the railing, rolled up her sleeves to cool off, and that's when he saw it. Bruises, clear as day, faint but fresh, right on her upper arm. Finger marks. George froze. It hit him like a gut punch. She saw his eyes widen, realized what he'd seen, and pulled the sleeve back down fast. Too fast. She gave him this quick, tight smile, like nothing was wrong, like she didn't want to talk about it, but George couldn't let it slide. He walked over and asked quietly, "Cassie, what happened?" She looked away. "Nothing," she said almost too quickly. "Just clumsy." George didn't buy it. Not for a second. But he didn't want to push her in front of others. So later that night he found Diddy alone by the bar and tried a different approach. "I saw Cassie earlier," he said carefully. "She didn't look okay." Diddy raised an eyebrow, then gave this little laugh. Not a warm one. More like a cold chuckle, like George had just said something naive. "You don't get it, man," Diddy said. "You think you understand, but you don't. Me and her, we have a different kind of thing. You wouldn't understand." George said he stared at him for a second, trying to figure out if he was joking. But he wasn't. I remember thinking, that wasn't a relationship, that was control. And that moment, that exchange with Diddy, changed everything. It confirmed the unease George had been feeling for months. This wasn't just a bad boyfriend situation. This was something much deeper, something darker. He didn't say anything else to Diddy that night. He just left, got in his car and drove home in silence. But that image of Cassie, bruised, covering up, pretending, stayed with him. And the way Diddy brushed it off, like it was normal, it made George feel sick. In court, he paused again after telling that story, looked around the room. The silence was thick. No one moved. No one whispered. "I didn't say anything back then," he admitted, his voice low. And I've regretted. By the time George finished telling that story, the courtroom felt still, like everyone had stopped breathing without realizing it. Even the judge, who hadn't flinched all day, leaned slightly forward. You could tell something had shifted. This wasn't just testimony anymore, it was something more human, more raw. The prosecutor gave George a moment, then asked one final question. "Mr. Clooney, why did you come forward now?" George looked out across the courtroom, eyes steady. "Because silence protects the wrong people," he said. There wasn't any dramatic flair in his voice, just quiet honesty, like a man who'd wrestled with guilt, with hesitation, and finally chose to do what was right. Late, maybe, but still. He said he hadn't come to condemn or to grab headlines. He didn't even want to be here, truthfully. But after hearing what Cassie had gone through, everything that came out in the lawsuits, in the interviews, in the testimony, he couldn't keep his own piece of the truth buried any longer. "I'm not here to pretend I was close to her," he said. "But I saw enough to know something was wrong, and I didn't speak up. That's on me." He paused, then added, "But if my voice helps add even one more drop of truth to what this woman's been through, then I'll say it. Every word." There was a kind of quiet courage in how he spoke. No showmanship. Just a man sitting under oath, owning up to the silence that too often surrounds power and abuse. And the way he looked around that courtroom, you could tell he wasn't just speaking to the lawyers or to the judge. He was speaking to the people watching, to the public, maybe even to other people in the industry who'd seen things and kept their heads down. George ended with this: "I don't know what justice looks like in a case like this, but I know it starts with people telling the truth, even the uncomfortable parts, especially those." With that, he leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands unclenched, and for the first time since he walked into that courtroom, it looked like something had lifted off of him, just a little. The judge thanked him. The prosecutor nodded, and George Clooney stepped down from the stand, not as a movie star, not as a celebrity witness. but as a man who finally chose to speak when it mattered.